Welcome to Borders and Belonging, a podcast that explores innovative migration research and connects the dots to real-world impacts. This series is produced by CERC Migration in collaboration with Lead Podcasting. I'm Maggie Perzyna, a researcher with the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration Program at Toronto Metropolitan University. This episode will explore the power of collective action and the transformative impact of bringing refugee voices to the forefront. How do we ensure that those most affected by migration policies aren't just consulted, but central to the decision-making process? Today, we'll be joined by two respected researchers to help us delve into how we can center migrant voices in these discussions and put the principles behind Nothing About Us Without Us into practice. But first, let's hear from someone at the forefront of this shift. Mustafa Alio is not just a policy advocate. He's a living testament to the importance of lived experience in shaping global migrant decisions. Born in Syria, Mustafa arrived in Canada with dreams of building a business. However, his personal story of displacement and the challenges faced by fellow refugees shifted his path dramatically.
I come from a business background. I never intended to get into the non-for-profit, the NGO, the policy space on refugees. I think what I had to go through, myself and my family, I think that's what got me into the space.
Mustafa Alio is the co-management director of RSEAT, an organization advocating for refugees seeking equal access at decision-making tables. But Mustafa's more than just an advocate. He's a symbol of change. The first refugee ever to be asked to advise a Canadian delegation to the UN, his story is both inspiring and groundbreaking.
Today, this kind of knowledge that most decision makers rely on in terms of building or making decisions of that, of the global system, it is a knowledge that being produced by the West. It is a knowledge that being produced by those with not lived experience.
Mustafa came to Canada with hopes of getting an MBA and starting a business, but things didn't go as planned. The average cost of an MBA in Canada sits between $30,000 and $40,000, which was more expensive than Mustafa could afford. And when the Syrian civil war began in 2011, although he had landed a job at a bank in Toronto, Mustafa's attention was drawn back home.
When the uprising happened, I start, writing a few stuffs online because a lot of people were saying, see what happened to Syria. That because of those people like uprising and all of that, because at this point, the regime were calling people infiltrators or extremists or kind of terrorists in there. I wrote something around. So here is a comparison between the 70s and 2010, which is a year before the revolution. And then you see the projections, like how Syria basically went from maybe top 10 in the world when it comes to like resources, education, and all of that. We had the first ever stock market. Streetcars, for example, just kind of a small thing. But I didn't know in the 50s, there was like a streetcar in Syria. Even women voting rights was like in Syria before.
Mustafa's blog got a lot more attention than he expected, mostly from people who disagreed with his message. He received several online threats, including warnings that he would never be allowed to return to Syria. Members of his family, still in Syria, began facing backlash at work. So in 2012, Mustafa applied for asylum in Canada.
And what strikes me at this point is like everyone was thinking about, especially supporting refugees, but in a way is like the focus was on food, on medical, on registration, housing and all of that. But then you talk to people and then after housing, always like the first question, how can I get a job?
When Syrian refugees started arriving in Canada in 2015, Mustafa volunteered his time to get them the care and services they needed. But he noticed a disconnect between what the refugees actually needed and what Canadian volunteers and policymakers believed they needed.
Like some of those people who would sponsor refugees or support refugees, where you start talking about refugees as their pet. Like, my refugee is this and this and this. And there's always this kind of a subconscious plays in a way that refugees are, helpless or poor or maybe uneducated. And no matter how you fight it, it's somehow, somewhere in every single mind, it exists.
Let's take a step back to 2015, a year when global migration hit record numbers. At that time, about 65 million people around the world were forcibly displaced. In 2016, all 193 member states of the United Nations came together and agreed on a crucial point: protecting those forced to flee their homes and supporting the countries that shelter them is a shared responsibility. Out of this commitment, the Global Compact on Refugees was born, a framework designed to make that vision a reality.
When the compact was signed and agreed on by majority of UN states, including Canada, then the idea is like, okay, and what does that mean? How can government basically involve refugees? Would government be open to bring a refugee advisor on a delegation, not to represent refugees, for that refugee advisor to represent Canada? So that's kind of the point. So in a way, I'm an official member on a Canadian delegation. I bring the refugee perspective, and I bring the expertise of something that Canada was, wanted to lead on, which is economic inclusion and labor mobility path.
Mustafa was just the person for the job. Not only did he bring his experience as a migrant in Canada to the compact, he shared his expertise in helping refugees find careers and creative employment connections in their new home. This is exactly what he had been working towards since arriving in Canada. It was the driving force behind the organization he founded in 2015, Jumpstart Refugee Talent. The Global Compact on Refugees was a big success and aligned perfectly with Mustafa's mission.
And what also was cool and unique about this, that Canada was open to that, because then the Minister of Immigration, which is leading on this, was Ahmed Hussein, who came to Canada as a refugee himself. So somehow there was a little bit more political openness toward that. Then in 2020, Canada announced at this point that moving forward, Canada would never be on any delegation without having refugee advisor. I think that was my ultimate celebration, because it wasn't a celebration I was the first. If I was the first and the last, then that would have been a very tokenistic approach. Like I could have just like, hey, I was on a delegation and that's it, done. But in the fact that I wasn't the last, this is the ultimate celebration. This is kind of the win.
At the 2019 Global Refugee Forum, Canada was the only country with a refugee advisor. It was a first for Canada and for Mustafa, and it's safe to say the world took notice. At the next Global Refugee Forum in 2023, Mustafa says a total of 13 countries had added a refugee advisor to the litigation. It's a big improvement, but Mustafa says there's a long way to go.
It's going to be a long journey. It's going to be a very difficult one, because it's all about the knowledge production. And if that knowledge production is not being produced from where the majority of refugees are in, then this is an issue. There is knowledge being produced by the Global South. It's not being taken by decision makers. Academia is a powerful tool. It's not being utilized properly. It's not an equal space. It's not an easy space. I always try to acknowledge my own privilege when I work with refugees, in a way. I'm someone right now who's with lived experience, but in the West, I have all those tools and all of that in front of me. But unless all of us, right, unless we start basically understand that sharing the power and then the privilege that we have is the path to making the change in the future. And then sharing that power, it doesn't mean that we get less recognition. Sharing the power get you, in the long run, more recognition.
Mustafa Alio is the co-management director of RSEAT and a powerful advocate for centering refugee voices in decision-making. Many thanks to him for sharing his insights on the importance of representation in global migration policy. To help us explore the impact of centering refugee voices in migration research are Professor Oroub El-Abed and Professor James Milner. Oroub is an associate professor in the Forced Migration Program at Birzeit University and the Middle East Regional Research Coordinator for the LERRN project. James is an associate professor of political science and the director of the Migration and Diaspora Studies program at Carleton University. He is also the project director of LERRN, a 7-year partnership project between researchers and civil society actors primarily in Canada, Jordan, Kenya, Lebanon, and Tanzania. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about the LERRN project and why you think it's an important contribution to migration research.
Thank you very much for having me and for giving me the chance to talk about the refugees we had the chance to meet with in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. The importance of the project studying refugee-led organizations in these three countries, number one, focuses on understanding how refugee communities can organize themselves, can work together in order to address their rights, issues where they are addressing very basic rights for them. The most important thing here is refugees in Jordan and Lebanon do not fall under the umbrella of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Hence, they are given their rights as part of certain, I may call it, policies that are customized in order to serve them. Meanwhile, those refugees in Turkey do fall under a state that is a signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention and hence has tailored particular policies to serve them with their basic rights. The important thing about this research very much helped us to understand how refugees under different policies are able to maneuver, are able to secure their rights, are able to come together in order to help one another, but also secure some basic rights that are not given to them by the host countries. The most important thing about our research as well, through the coordinators in the three countries, we managed not only to limit ourselves to refugees within urban settings, but also we widened our understanding of the refugees in a wider scale, in wider geographic scale. So in each country, we covered people in camps, people outside camps, also to understand how does it happen. We did not limit ourselves to one group of refugees, but we managed to cover all the refugees, the main groups of refugees in the three countries. I'll give very much of an example. In Jordan, often the talk is about Syrian refugees. For the LERRN project, we managed to work on Palestinian refugees who are not holders of the citizenship, Syrians, Iraqi refugees, Sudanese and Somali. In Turkey, we were able to address Syrians, Afghani, Irani, and even some groups of Palestinians, surprisingly enough. So in Lebanon, we had the chance to work on two main groups, which were the Palestinians and the Syrians, and we had some cases where we covered some Sudanese cases within Lebanon. So that was very much seeking to understand the way they maneuver, the way they seek to get their efforts together and to be able to build up their efforts in the host country, but also in connecting with networks in the diaspora.
James, what inspired the partnership and what do you see as its key goals?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. The inspiration of the project is to recognize that the way that we respond to displacement situations around the world really isn't working. Billions of dollars every year are contributed to refugee responses primarily in regions of the global south, like the Middle East and in East Africa. But those responses tend to reflect the policy priorities of donor countries and host governments that want to contain refugees in the spaces where they live, as opposed to seeking lasting solutions and ensuring protection for refugees. So the real inspiration of the goal of the LERRN partnership, which started in 2018, was to recognize that if we can really foreground our evidence in the perspective of those who were most affected by displacement, we can identify new knowledge, that we can find innovative responses, that we can build evidence that will contribute to more lasting, meaningful, and rights-based change. So the inspiration of the project was really to recognize that the current system doesn't work, that 75% of the world's displaced people are not in countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, or European countries, that they're in fact in these protracted refugee situations in regions in the global south that themselves are affected by these challenges. But the individuals in context of displacement don't wait passively for responses to come. So in 2018, the project began with support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council here in Canada with working groups in East Africa, in Kenya, Tanzania, and also in Lebanon and in Jordan, to really ask how can we do research in a new way, and how can we mobilize that research in a way that's going to contribute to change. And the pandemic was this real pivot moment in the work of what we were doing and what so many were doing. And it was in that early days of the pandemic when international actors and many large international NGOs had to shelter in place that we saw how refugee communities themselves were mobilizing to provide for the needs of members of their community. And that's what led to this very specific research in comparing refugee-led responses in 4 countries in East Africa, 3 countries in the Middle East, and to recognize how much we have to learn from those who are affected by displacement. And the bottom line is that refugees are not waiting passively for international actors to come and provide for them, that they are active partners with innovative solutions, with knowledge that needs to be part of the conversation on how we can make our global responses to displacement more effective.
You recently published a paper recognizing the growing importance of refugee-led organizations, or RLOs for short, in different local contexts. How do civil society actors put the idea of nothing about us without us into practice for migrant communities?
To answer this, we need to understand that the word civil society is quite wide. So, because remember, refugee-led organizations are also part of the civil society we're talking about. So let's divide it here. To start with, it is essential for the civil society actors, government, host governments, UN bodies, to understand that there are certain rights that needs to be given to the refugees. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important to understand how these rights are being given. Countries that are not signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention are not giving the rights the way other countries that are signatory. So firstly, we need to very much call for ensuring that basic rights are given to these refugees. Secondly, it's very important to actively involve refugees and migrants in decision-making processes. In the design of any project, it's important to take into consideration these particular groups that are called refugees, that are often forgotten. It's essential, and here we come to another important element that we encountered while in the field, how decision makers, civil society entities build hand-in-hand capacity of those refugees in order for them to be able to properly organize themselves. This is very important and very essential. We do not expect refugees to organize themselves and to lead organizations, whether recognized or whether registered or not registered, on their own. So the role of supporting, partnering with these RLOs in order to enable them to have better role and better participation in the wider civil society. It's important to advocate for the socioeconomic inclusion. I'll give the example of Jordan. The word social inclusion in the Jordan response plan handling the Syrian refugees in Jordan emphasized the social inclusion. Sadly, that was not clearly put. How? What kind of role these civil society bodies need to do in order to ensure the social inclusion. So by putting really programs, working together with refugees, this can be very much implemented. And finally, I believe it's important to ensure that the voices of refugee-led organizations are meaningful enough, are put in a meaningful impact, are making a meaningful impact on policies and programs. Again, this is a way where we are permitting refugees, we are seeing refugees as agents. This is one of the issues that we often encounter in the Middle East, that refugees are very much labeled as a burden. And the way we can see that we give the refugees space is by seeing them as an asset to the economy, an asset to the culture. And by this, we're calling for their rights and dignities, but also we're permitting them to lead more effective and sustainable outcomes through policies and practices.
James, you've written about meaningful refugee participation as an emerging norm in the global refugee regime. How can we ensure that including migrant voices is not just a token gesture, but an integral part of migration policymaking?
Yeah, I think that's such a central question, and it really builds on the examples that Oroub was giving from Jordan and the work with her and her team in Lebanon and Jordan. And I think it's to begin by recognizing that while quite a bit of lip service has been paid to participation, that it's often been quite tokenistic, and that many civil society actors have not actually practiced the idea of nothing about us without us, but that they have used the stories and the narratives of those who've been displaced as a way of advancing their own policy priorities, their own advocacy priorities. So we've seen a proliferation over the years of not only images of refugees, but stories from refugees, and the notion of the heroism of refugees, the resilience of refugees, used as a way to seek support for UN agencies and international NGOs. And so I think the first way that we ensure that participation of refugees is not tokenistic is to take a conscious step back and to think about, how do we share power? Who has power, and how do we ensure that that power is shared? I'll give an example from two contexts. One, the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, and the second from meetings of the Global Refugee Forum in Geneva. The Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya is so heavily researched that they actually have a research manual on how to navigate the logistics of conducting research in Kakuma. And often we have found that research in spaces like Kakuma are quite extractive, that external researchers come in, either consultants working with aid agencies or academic researchers, will come in with their own questions. Their research agenda is set. They'll approach organizations like Action pour le Progrès, refugee-led organizations led by Pascal Zigashane in the Kakuma refugee camp. And they'll say, we need your help with our research. We need you to find 15 refugee men who have experienced police violence in the past year. And that's their role, is to bring together respondents for a question. But if Pascal or his colleagues, or if other refugee-led organizations, they say, well, why are you asking that question? The answer is, well, that's the question that we're here to ask. So in a context like Kakuma, and in local contexts, it comes down to a sharing of power, a shifting of power, to ensure that those who've been affected by displacement are involved at the very beginning as partners. They're involved in setting the research agenda, in determining what the research questions are, that we have an openness to the different forms that knowledge can take, that there's a recognition of the need for the co-production of knowledge. But then the results of that research, the knowledge that's produced, is then co-owned. It's not the exclusive domain of researchers or civil society partners to take that research away and use it for their own ends, but to include the partners who've been involved in the production of knowledge in thinking about how that knowledge can be translated, can be mobilized to bring about change. So that's in a local context like Kakuma. These dynamics get magnified incredibly when we get into a global setting like international meetings in Geneva. And this is where the norm of meaningful refugee participation is most present in its emergence. What we have found is in these global meetings that there has been a shift from refugees being invited into global meetings to tell their story, to inspire the participants, and then asked to leave as the business of the meeting takes place, to now where we see refugee advocates with lived experience of displacement demanding to participate not just because of their experience, but because of their expertise. So there's a group called Our Seats, Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table, that's working with governments around the world to include refugee advisors in their delegations to these meetings, offering training to these refugee advisors so that they are able to navigate the politics of these global meetings, and demanding that refugees are involved not only in the meetings themselves, but in the setting of the agenda, in determining who the speakers are going to be at these events, in holding to account those who are involved in decision-making. So we see a movement not only in the level of participation. At the Global Refugee Forum in 2019, there were fewer than 80 refugee participants. At the last Global Refugee Forum in 2023, out of 4,500 participants, there were more than 400 participants with lived experience of displacement. So, the number is increasing, but the substantive role of refugees in this process is what's changing. And this is where we see this norm emerging, that it's no longer seen as acceptable to have a decision-making process where those who have experienced displacement are excluded. Imagine a UN meeting on the rights of women, on the rights of indigenous people, on the rights of persons with disabilities, where individuals who identify as women, who are from indigenous communities, or who have persons with disabilities, if they're not present and if they're not participating in those meetings are not seen to be legitimate. So it's this active role in not just participating in meetings, but in shaping the agenda. That's the shift that we're seeing, and that's the move from tokenistic participation to meaningful participation.
Oroub, what are the main challenges to effective collaboration and mobilization?
The challenges are too many. I'm going to start with the first one. What do we mean by RLOs? And this was one of the very first things we had to go through, and James connected us with the UNHCR in order for us to understand what do we really mean by refugee-led organizations, and when these organizations as refugee-led can seek funding from the international community or can seek support from the local civil society bodies. Now, that was the very beginning of understanding the challenges that refugees encounter. The definition wasn't quite clear, and the word organization, until today, continues to be an issue for many refugees in the region. Recently, I was contacted by a group of Sudanese. This is the third time they reach out to me, asking me, we do have a buddy who wants to send us money from the UK. How can we receive the money? Because they are not registered. And so the first issue is the funding. Receiving the funding as what? As an organization that's unable to be registered, because in Jordan and Lebanon, refugees are not permitted to register their own civil society entities. And because of this inability to have their own NGOs, or let's call it an NGO because they would fall under the registration of the Ministry of Social Development, they end up being unable to receive any kind of support. It was 2 years ago when the UNHCR announced that it will be allocating few millions in order to be distributed to RLOs all over the world. And one of the questions is, how do they define RLOs? Are they supposed to be registered with a host country, or are they supposed really to be registered abroad? So this challenge was addressed by the refugees through two means, as we managed to trace them in the region. Number one, few of them, of the RLOs, ended up going and registering themselves as social enterprises, between parentheses, non-profit companies. And by doing that, they partnered with a Jordanian or a Lebanese entity or a Turkish entity through which they were able to receive the money and the funding. Number two, and that was the common case that we found in the three countries, is that they opted to register abroad. So they connect with the diaspora in the West and with their family members, relatives, friends, etc. They managed to create an NGO abroad. In Germany, for example, there is the Syrian Humsi Association, which is extremely active in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Turkey. And we were very lucky to visit them in the three bases. They have been able to act strongly because they were able to register abroad. And through this abroad registration, they were able to channel the funding to their local entities in the region. This is one of the challenges. For example, the Sudanese, the example I mentioned earlier to you, they were completely unable to register another body elsewhere. So they continue till today to encounter these issues of not being able to receive the money or to get any kind of support from any entity, whether is it local or international. Another challenge is the issue of representation. Very much talking to the point that was raised by James. One of the issues we came across in the three countries that host countries tended to support few entities with, I may call them old refugees, in order to create RLOs, although those people who are leading these RLOs are very protracted old refugees who have been living in the country for a long time. We came across, for example, this very much in Turkey, where we met with Afghani associations, and these Afghani associations were led by refugees who arrived in Turkey some 40, 60 years ago. And they were asked by the government, by the host state, to come and lead these entities in order for them to make use of the language and of the culture that these refugees have oriented themselves with the host country so that they can support the newcomers. Now, the question, how these refugees are representative enough of the newcomers. So the issue of representation is definitely one of the challenges. Are they really doing their job rightly? Are they really representative enough of the needs? Are they voicing out the needs of the newcomers, of refugees, or not? So this is another challenge that definitely we need to think of. Think as well and raise the issue of the legal status once again. As long as the countries we're talking about are not recognizing rights for their refugees, this very much creates an issue because these refugees are unable to act and are once again, it's not only receiving funding, but they're unable to do any kind of activities. They're unable to be mobile between cities because of this issue of rights and where they can stop and where they can go out and what is their mobility rights. That gets us into the problem that we encountered in both Jordan and Lebanon, particularly as countries that are not signatory of the 51 Convention. These two countries fail to have domestic laws dealing with refugees. And this is very much of an issue. It's an issue because the refugees are treated in these countries based on very, I may call it, urgent policies that are very much tailored to address very much of an emergency, but they are not able to handle or to deal with refugees as people who are resident with their protractedness in the place that can be very much of an asset and an added value to the society and to the economy. So this very much raises very much of concerns with how to deal with the refugees and with their organization and with their mobilization.
James, can you tell me about projects where refugee voices were central in creating successful solutions or policies?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's in identifying these examples of impact where we realize the true potential of meaningful refugee participation and in sharing power in not only generating knowledge, but in mobilizing that knowledge for change. Two examples come to mind, one around changing policies and one around finding solutions. In terms of changing policies, there's an extraordinary story to be told, again in Kenya, in the Kakuma refugee camps, on how the refugee community mobilized to raise the issue of the protection needs of members of the LGBTQI plus community in Kakuma. This was an issue that was not prominent for either the government of Kenya or for civil society partners and UN agencies in Kenya at the time. And it was with refugee community voices and leaders connecting with civil society, civil rights actors in Kenya that were able to document the very differentiated protection challenges that members of the LGBTQI plus community faced, not only fearing persecution because of their experience in their country of origin, but facing discrimination, marginalization as a result of their gender identity or their sexual orientation, and how that was an issue that wasn't on the agenda of the more powerful actors in the refugee response ecosystem in Kenya, and how the refugee community was able to find partners who were able to help document that experience and propose solutions. We now see the protection mechanisms in place for members of the LGBTQI plus refugee community in the Kakuma camp in Kenya and elsewhere are not perfect, but are certainly better. And where it is a classic example of where we engage in a shared process of identifying questions or issues that need to be on the research and policy agenda, that issues are raised that we wouldn't have otherwise anticipated. So this issue would never have been on the agenda had it not been for members of the refugee community actively raising it. So that's an example of how policies can change. But I think what is really powerful is to look at how practical solutions are developed and implemented by refugee communities themselves. And again, the pandemic was a moment where we could no longer ignore how refugees mobilize consistently to respond to the needs of their own community. Research in East Africa showed that 80% of refugees will turn first to the members of their own community for support before going to international organizations or international NGOs. But I think for me, one of the most powerful examples of the potential of refugee-led initiatives comes from the response to the earthquake in Turkey and northwest Syria in 2023, where one refugee-led organization called the Mulhan Team launched a crowdfunding campaign to leverage support from the Syrian diaspora around the world to mobilize emergency response for refugees whose homes had been destroyed or children who'd been left orphaned as a result of this extraordinary, powerful earthquake. The Mulhan team raised over $13.5 million through more than 220,000 donations. So average donations in the area of $50 or $60 from thousands of individuals in the diaspora was not only able to mobilize a really impressive level of funding, but because of the networks within which the Mulhan team operates, with the way that they were able to work with community partners that were in these affected areas, because they were so embedded within the community, the impact of that $13.5 million was amplified. And when we think about the level of international support, the funding that goes to refugee responses, we don't think of refugee-led responses as being capable of raising funds in the millions of dollars. And so I think it's a recognition that the meaningful inclusion of refugees in discussion of solutions is not just an ethically desirable thing to do. It's not just, it is a normatively desirable change that those who are affected by the policies and programs are designed that should be part of the conversation of what those programs look like. But even if we look at this from a very crude measure of effectiveness, of efficiency, if we look at it purely from a substantive question of who are the partners that can help deliver successful solutions in a cost-effective way, refugee-led responses need to be part of that conversation. And I think the example of responding to the earthquake in Turkey, the work of the Mulhan team, the work of the refugee rights community that mobilized around the protection needs of members of the LGBTQI plus community in Kenya really illustrate that this is an evidence-based conversation that we need to be having about the substantive value that the meaningful inclusion of refugees in research and policy and program design is not just ethically desirable, but is substantively useful. It's in this response that we'll be able to find those examples of innovation that can bring about change.
It's very true. I'd like to add to what James raised, the strength of Mulhan as a really, you have hit the nail, James, by giving the example of Mulhan, in my view, their strength have come not only with working with refugees and displaced people on the ground, but also this idea of navigating through the dynamics of the international community. And that was quite important. I mentioned the example of the Homs Association. Here we are talking about Mulhim team, Syrian Across Borders. These are very successful models that we managed to come across in the region. And they managed to succeed because there was this cross-border collaboration where Syrians came together not only from the Middle East, but they also connected with Syrians abroad, and they managed to bypass the limitations and the policy limitations of the region by registering abroad, by acting from abroad. We give them really this kind of smart mobilization is to be given the credit. And it's clearly seen in the kind of impact they are doing in the region because of this mobilization, is that they did not stop. The state did not permit them to register. They went abroad, they registered, and they came back. And they made that effect difference on the people in these three countries.
What new challenges and opportunities do you see for LERRN and similar initiatives in the Global South as the global refugee situation of James?
The opportunity that is before us right now is really threefold. To be able to change, to shift from theory to practice. I think the normative case of meaningful participation has been made. I think there is now a recognition that this is, whether we're at global meetings in New York or Geneva or community level meetings in camps in Kenya or in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, there's a recognition that the way that we have worked before, it doesn't work. It's that emperor's new clothes moment that we've now seen it for what it is. And, to quote Oprah Winfrey, know better, do better. So we now know. And so the challenge now is to do. So the question is, how do we then go about doing this work differently? And so I think that's a challenge and an opportunity. The opportunity is that there is an appetite for a new way of working. The challenge is, how do we go about doing that? And that leads to the second challenge, which is really a culture change within the global research community in thinking about how we partner with individuals and organizations in contexts that are most affected by displacement. And I think it's a shift in thinking of what constitutes knowledge, how we go about research, how we take credit for research, how we document that, how career progress is measured. I mean, it's a massive shift that needs to happen in global North contexts at a time where universities are facing constraints and where there's increasing demand for individual productivity. So that's a real challenge that we face in the wider research community. But I think the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity is to be able to more thoroughly and systematically document what's already happening, to do more of the work that Oroub and her team led in the Middle East so effectively, what the East Africa team was able to do, what researchers are now doing in South America, is really moving from anecdote to evidence. It is really building that evidence base that, anecdotally, we hear these examples of the amazing work of Coalition pour Venezuela, a refugee-led organization working in 12 countries in South America and mobilizing the skills of refugees as doctors and teachers. The examples that we've been talking about in this conversation from East Africa and the Middle East, we need to move from talking about these as anecdotes and examples and really develop that coherent, systematic evidence base that cuts across context, and really to be able to say, what can we learn from these examples? How can we put these examples of innovation and change into conversation with each other to really reimagine the entire global refugee regime, the global refugee response system? So the challenge that we now have is, first of all, for those of us, I recognize deeply my own positionality as a tenured professor at a global North university with tremendous privilege and opportunity, how can I continue to think about how my privilege can be leveraged, mobilized, recognized, and shared in a way that contributes to a shift in power? That needs to happen at an individual level and at an industry level, at a community level, at a level of the global research community, to really think about how we change the way that we work and to recognize, as David Turton said decades ago, those of us who have built academic careers on studying refugee responses, our work is only ethically defensible if the research that we do in some way contributes to positive change in the human condition that we study. And so it's a moment of reckoning for the global research community, certainly for researchers in the global North, for institutions in the global North, to rethink how we go about doing this. And so the challenge is less in the global South. The challenge in the global South, yes, is of questions of power, of questions of security of those who are conducting research. We see this very much in the context of the war in Gaza, that those who conduct research that is seen to be contrary to particular political agendas are silenced. But the vast majority of contexts in the global South, greater solidarity, greater sharing of power, greater sharing of resources with those who are already engaged in these areas of research, policy, and practice, is what will contribute to a change at a system level, and will ultimately result, I believe, in a refugee system that is more able to deliver on its decades-old mandate of ensuring protection for refugees and finding a durable solution to their displacement.
So I think you've both made an excellent case already, but for a final question, I want to ask you, why does this research matter?
It matters because the situation is becoming, in my view, more and more difficult. The number of protracted refugee situation is increasing with millions of refugees. Look what's happening today in Gaza and see what's happening today in Sudan. So we're having Syrians who are protracted in the Middle East region. We're having new flows of refugees and displaced that are very much stranded. We need really to start thinking in a strategic way. Do we accept that those people continue to be living in these harsh conditions with no rights, with states that have not taken the right measures in order to address the needs of these refugees? There is today an alarming matter happening. It's the depletion of funding that is given by the international community to refugees. It matters because today a country like Jordan and a country like Lebanon, added to Turkey, another signatory country of the 1951 Convention, have been all calling for sending back the refugees to their countries. And this is very much of a worrying matter. Sending them where? And sending them to who? And sending them to be under what rule? We need to see what's happening on the ground, realize the limitations that refugees are having in these host countries in order to start thinking maybe of new solutions. We have 3 durable solutions that fall under the 1951 Refugee Convention. The 3 solutions are not working. Not repatriation, definitely. The local integration, as the examples that I mentioned from the Middle East, are failing completely because of the failing policies of the Middle East to deal with refugees as a plus and as an asset. And of course, resettlement to a third country is completely out of discussion in a world that's run by a policy of containment, where refugees are better off to remain in the regions they come from. So is it maybe time, through our understanding of what's happening in the field, to start thinking of new solutions? And it is our role, in my view, to keep our cases from the field, from what we're seeing in the field, out loud, for our policymakers to hear us, and for other researchers also to join efforts with us. because we cannot do it alone. We really need to do this kind of collaboration at our level as researchers, but also to support those refugees that are very much working in the underground, in the height, in order for them to bring out their voices for policy makers to be aware of.
James, same question to you.
I'm going to practice what I preach and give Oroub the last word. I think she's said it wonderfully.
Thanks to Oroub El-Abed and James Milner for joining me today. And thank you for listening. This is a CERC Migration podcast produced in collaboration with Lead Podcasting. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe to Borders and Belonging on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on inclusive policy making, please visit the show notes. Do you want to share your thoughts or additional research about refugees? We'd love to hear from you. Follow the Borders and Belonging LinkedIn page and be part of the conversation. I'm Maggie Perzyna. Thanks for listening.